What happened inside the British royal family on March 10th, 2026, is not something history books will gloss over. This was not a polite reshuffling. This was not a gentle nudge toward reform. This was not even the kind of behind-closed-doors negotiation that has characterized royal crisis management for generations. According to multiple corroborating reports from sources with direct knowledge of palace operations, Prince William did something that no monarch or heir apparent in modern British history has ever done. He stripped two princesses of everything. Their titles, their roles, their residences, their patronages, their institutional connections, their access to family communications, their ceremonial functions, gone. Not suspended pending review. Not temporarily withdrawn until the dust settles. Not quietly discouraged with the hope they'd simply fade from public view. Gone. And the reason behind it, sources claim, runs so deep and so dark that even the most seasoned royal commentators, people who have covered this family through divorces, scandals, and international controversies for decades, are struggling to find the right words to describe what they're witnessing. So here's the question that should be burning in your mind right now. How does a royal family that has survived wars, abdications, and scandals for over 1,000 years end up publicly dismantling itself from the inside? How does an institution synonymous with continuity, tradition, and institutional patience arrive at a moment where a future king draws a line so sharp and so final that it effectively exiles two members of his own family? Stay with me, because the answer is more complicated and frankly more jaw-dropping than anything you've seen from Buckingham Palace before. And if you think you understand where this story is going based on what you've read in the headlines, I promise you, the full picture is far more unsettling than the summaries suggest. Let's start where this story really begins, because understanding March 2026 requires understanding what was already broken long before William picked up that pen. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, has been one of the most controversial figures in the monarchy for years. His association with convicted financier Jeffrey Epstein had already cost him his official royal duties back in 2022. The palace, in its classic time-honored tradition of quietly sweeping scandals under a very expensive rug, tried to contain the damage to Andrew alone. And for a while, it worked, at least on the surface. The strategy was straightforward. Isolate the problem, limit the contamination, preserve the institution by sacrificing one individual. Beatrice and Eugenie, his daughters, were kept at a comfortable distance from the worst of it. They maintained their titles. They attended royal events. They were presented, publicly at least, as two young women unfortunate enough to have a complicated father, two princesses who deserved sympathy rather than scrutiny. The optics were managed. The narrative held. But narratives, it turns out, have expiration dates. And the expiration date on this particular narrative arrived with a suddenness that has left even veteran palace observers breathless. Because here's where it all starts to unravel, and this is the part that nobody in the royal family wanted you to find out. This is the part that, according to sources, prompted emergency meetings, frantic legal consultations, and conversations so difficult that participants reportedly emerged looking as though they'd aged years in the space of hours. According to reports that began surfacing in early 2026, investigators didn't just find isolated wrongdoing tied to Andrew's role as a former UK trade envoy. What they allegedly uncovered was a network, a broader web of financial irregularities, diplomatic manipulation, and questionable international dealings that extended far beyond one disgraced royal and his unfortunate associations. And critically, sources claim that Beatrice and Eugenie were not simply bystanders who happened to be related to the wrong person. According to these reports, both sisters had allegedly maintained contact with individuals connected to Epstein's network even after his death in 2019. Now, I want to be extremely careful here, because these are allegations, not confirmed legal findings, and in the court of public opinion, we have a terrible habit of rushing to verdict without the patience for due process. But the scale of what is being reported is significant enough that it cannot be dismissed as royal gossip or tabloid speculation. Independent investigators, according to sources, flagged what they described as questionable financial transactions, including luxury gifts of a value and frequency that raised immediate red flags, transactions that were allegedly interpreted by recipients as payments for silence, as rewards for ongoing cooperation, as the kind of financial entanglement that creates obligations that are difficult to escape. That phrase alone, payments for silence, should make you pause. Should make you reconsider everything you thought you understood about the York family's relationship to the Epstein scandal. Should make you ask the uncomfortable question: what exactly were these princesses in a position to remain silent about? And it doesn't stop there, because what allegedly follows makes the financial irregularities look almost minor by comparison. Reports describe something called shadow diplomacy, a practice in which Princess Beatrice allegedly shared sensitive institutional information during unofficial international visits. Think about what that means for a moment. Not a public statement delivered with proper clearance. Not an official briefing vetted by the Foreign Office. Not the kind of carefully calibrated diplomatic engagement that royal representatives are trained to conduct, but the alleged quiet passing of information during trips that were never supposed to be diplomatic in the first place. Trips presented as personal visits, as family holidays, as the private movements of a young woman with no official role. On top of that, sources allege that royal financial channels were misused to support Prince Andrew's legal settlements, creating a paper trail that investigators found deeply concerning. We're no longer talking about a family scandal. According to these reports, we are potentially talking about systemic institutional misconduct, the kind of organized, sustained pattern of behavior that cannot be explained away by poor judgment or unfortunate associations. And William, to his credit or perhaps simply out of necessity, apparently decided that the era of managing perception rather than enforcing accountability was officially over. The question was no longer how to make this look acceptable. The question was how to make it stop. This is where William's response becomes genuinely remarkable, and I say this as someone who has watched the monarchy navigate crisis after crisis with the same tired playbook of delay, deflect, and deny, the same exhausted strategies that have preserved the institution's surface while allowing its foundations to quietly rot. What he did in response to these findings was, by any measure, unprecedented. Working alongside Princess Anne, who, let's be honest, has always been the royal family member most likely to look at a problem and actually solve it rather than schedule a meeting about scheduling a meeting, William introduced what is being called the Royal Accountability and Ethics Act 2026. This legislation, according to reports, mandates independent audits of all royal family members' finances and communications, and creates a legal mechanism for expelling members who fail to comply. Not a suggestion, not a strongly worded letter, not the kind of informal pressure that can be ignored by anyone with sufficient family connections. A legal mechanism for removal. When Beatrice and Eugenie allegedly refused to cooperate with these audits, when they reportedly declined to open their financial records, their communications, their personal documents to the scrutiny that William had determined was now mandatory, their removal, according to reports, became immediate and irreversible. That is not a family having a difficult conversation at the dinner table. That is not the kind of dispute that can be resolved over Christmas at Sandringham. That is an institution drawing a line in constitutional terms, drawing it publicly, and daring anyone to cross it. The decree itself, according to reports, was sweeping in its scope. Beatrice and Eugenie lost all patronages, every charity, every organization, every cause they had represented. They lost all public roles, every engagement, every appearance, every function that came with their positions. Their corporate and institutional affiliations were terminated. Every board, every partnership, every commercial association that relied on their royal connection. But perhaps the most striking detail in all of this, the one that tells you just how seriously William was taking the situation, the one that separates this from any previous royal disciplinary action, is what happened with their residences and their children. Their homes were placed under police oversight to secure what investigators reportedly described as potential evidence. Their personal spaces, their private documents, their family records, all subject to the kind of scrutiny that royals have historically been protected from. And their children, which is a detail that sits uncomfortably no matter which side of this story you fall on, no matter how firmly you believe that accountability matters more than family feeling, were relocated under what sources describe as protective arrangements designed to shield them from the fallout of their parents' alleged conduct. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this doesn't carry a human cost. I'm not going to suggest that watching young children be moved, watching family homes be secured, watching princesses lose everything they've known, is somehow easy or clean or free of pain. These are real people, not chess pieces, not abstract symbols in some larger argument about institutional reform. They have feelings, attachments, relationships that matter to them. But from a purely institutional standpoint, from the perspective of someone trying to understand what William was thinking and why he made the choices he made, what he did signals something that the British monarchy has arguably never had the courage to do before. It chose the integrity of the institution over the comfort of family loyalty. It chose transparency over protection. It chose accountability over the thousand-year tradition of circling the wagons whenever anyone outside the family looked too closely at what was happening inside. Whether you find that admirable or cold-blooded probably says something profound about where your priorities lie, about what you believe institutions owe to the publics they serve, about whether you think royalty should be judged by the same standards as the rest of us. I'm not here to tell you which perspective is correct. I'm here to tell you that this choice was made, and that its consequences will reverberate for generations. Now, here's the part of this story that most coverage has underplayed, and I think it's arguably the most significant thread in the entire tapestry. Because Beatrice and Eugenie are not the only members of the extended royal family caught up in what appears to be a much larger reckoning. Parallel to the York crisis, and I am not sure parallel is even the right word, given that sources suggest the two cases may share financial threads, may be connected in ways that investigators are still working to understand. The situation involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle appears to have deteriorated significantly. Their unusual arrangement as what sources describe as part-time royals, operating commercially and independently in the United States, has apparently become legally and financially untenable. According to reports, the palace moved to neutralize their titles in practical terms, operating from the position that one cannot commercially exploit royal status while simultaneously refusing to operate within the institutional framework that gives that status its legitimacy. That is, when you think about it, a fairly airtight argument. You cannot have the brand without the responsibilities that built it. You cannot trade on the family name while refusing to be part of the family. You cannot expect the protections of the institution while positioning yourself as its critic. But it gets considerably more complicated from there, because sources claim that legal proceedings in California allegedly resulted in reduced custodial authority for Harry and Meghan over their children, Archie and Lilibet. According to these reports, both children were then relocated to the United Kingdom under something described as a London Sanctuary Protocol, a program reportedly overseen by senior royals, including Catherine, Princess of Wales, and designed to provide the children with stability and privacy. I want to tread carefully here, because these are children, and the instinct to sensationalize any story involving minors should be firmly resisted. The impulse to turn family tragedy into clickbait, to transform the complicated realities of custody arrangements into simplified narratives of good and bad, is one that responsible commentary must reject. What I will say is that if these reports are accurate, And I want to emphasize that qualification. Because the Sussex situation has generated so much misinformation that separating fact from fiction has become genuinely difficult. The situation in California had apparently reached a level that a court system, not Buckingham Palace, not the British press, not public opinion, but an independent court with its own processes and protections, judged to be sufficiently concerning to justify these arrangements. According to sources, the financial picture for the Sussexes is also considerably grimmer than their public profile might suggest. The much-discussed media deals that followed their departure from royal duties, the Netflix agreement, the Spotify partnership, the book contracts, the speaking engagements, have reportedly declined in value and frequency. Legal costs have reportedly mounted. The lifestyle they've maintained, the security arrangements they've insisted on, the staff they've employed, all of it costs money, and according to reports, the money is not flowing the way it once did. Reports also hint at possible financial connections between the York and Sussex cases, transactions, communications, relationships that investigators are reportedly examining for patterns, suggesting, if true, that what William is dealing with is not two separate family crises, but potentially one interconnected systemic problem. And if that's accurate, if the threads connecting these cases run deeper than anyone initially understood, then the scope of what William is confronting is larger, more complex, and more dangerous than even the most alarmist observers initially suggested. So who is left standing, and what does William actually plan to build from these ruins? Because here is where the story shifts from being purely about scandal and becomes genuinely interesting as a study in institutional transformation. It's one thing to tear things down, to remove people, to draw lines. It's quite another to build something new, to create structures that will last, to establish norms that will survive beyond one person's tenure. According to reports, William has been quietly assembling what sources are calling the Frontline Five, a core group of royals around whom the new, leaner, more accountable monarchy will be built. This group reportedly includes Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose steady presence and genuine popularity provide an anchor for the entire enterprise. Princess Anne, whose 5 decades of unquestioned service offer a model of what royal duty actually looks like. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose quiet professionalism and lack of drama have made her one of the most respected members of the family. And younger royals such as Lady Louise Windsor, who represents the next generation of service-oriented royals. What unites these individuals, according to those following the situation closely, is not just their family connections, but their demonstrated willingness to operate within the framework of duty, transparency, and institutional discipline that William is now enforcing for everyone. Princess Anne, in particular, deserves a moment of acknowledgement here. She has spent 5 decades doing the work without the drama, attending engagements, supporting charities, representing the crown at home and abroad, and generally conducting herself with a level of professionalism that makes the antics of certain other family members look all the more egregious by comparison. She has never sought the spotlight. She has never courted controversy. She has simply shown up year after year, doing what needed to be done with minimal complaint and maximum effectiveness. If William is building a monarchy for the 21st century, having Anne at the architectural table is not the worst decision anyone has ever made. Having someone who understands what actually works, what actually matters, what actually commands respect, that's not just a nice addition. That's essential. And here is what I find genuinely fascinating about the public reaction to all of this. Because you might expect that watching a royal family publicly expel 2 of its own members, watching children relocated, watching family fractures exposed in the most dramatic possible way, would generate widespread outrage or sympathy for the individuals involved. You might expect the tabloids to run sympathetic profiles of Beatrice and Eugenie, to highlight their charitable work, to position them as victims of an overzealous future king. According to reports, the reaction has been more nuanced than that. While the personal element, two women losing everything, children being relocated, a family fracturing in public, has generated shock and in some quarters genuine grief, the institution itself has reportedly seen its approval figures rise, particularly among younger generations. And this makes a certain kind of sense when you think about it. For decades, the criticism of the monarchy has not simply been that it is outdated or expensive, valid as those criticisms may be, but that it operates as a class apart, a system where wealth, title, and blood protect individuals from the consequences that ordinary people would face for the same conduct. The criticism has been that royalty plays by different rules, that accountability is for the rest of us, that the family name buys a kind of immunity that money alone cannot provide. What William appears to have done is demonstrate, in the most unambiguous terms possible, that this protection is no longer unconditional, that being born a princess does not mean being exempt from investigation, that having the right last name does not guarantee the right to refuse transparency. That is a significant message. That is the kind of message that resonates with people who have spent their lives watching the wealthy and powerful escape consequences that would crush anyone else. Whether it is a genuine philosophical shift or a strategic repositioning to preserve the institution's survival is, I think, a question worth sitting with. Probably both things are true. Probably William believes in accountability and also recognizes that accountability is the only thing that will save the monarchy from itself. Probably the line between principle and pragmatism is not as clean as we like to pretend. What I keep coming back to, personally, is the question of timing. March 2026 will be recorded as the moment the British monarchy chose accountability over comfort. But the conditions that made that choice necessary had been building for years, arguably decades. Prince Andrew's associations were not a secret. The financial opacity around certain royal households was not a surprise to anyone paying close attention. The Sussex situation had been festering in public view since 2020. The whispers about Beatrice and Eugenie had circulated in certain circles for years. What appears to have changed is not the existence of these problems, but the arrival of a future king willing to confront them rather than manage them. And whatever you think of the monarchy as an institution, whatever your views on its role in a modern democratic society, whatever your feelings about hereditary privilege and constitutional tradition, that shift in leadership philosophy is something worth recognizing. Because the alternative, continuing to paper over institutional rot with polished press releases and carefully managed public appearances, continuing to hope that scandals would fade if ignored long enough, continuing to prioritize family feeling over institutional integrity, would eventually have produced a crisis far more damaging than the one William is now navigating. Reform is painful. Managed decline is lethal. The situation, it must be noted, is still evolving. Investigations are ongoing. Many of the details around the alleged financial networks and diplomatic irregularities remain unresolved. Sources describe a picture that is still coming into focus, and responsible reporting requires acknowledging that what is alleged today may look different as legal processes unfold over the coming months. Some of what we think we know may turn out to be incomplete. Some of what sources are claiming may not survive the scrutiny of formal investigation. Some of the connections that look significant now may prove to be coincidental. That's how these things work. That's why we have processes, why we have courts, why we have standards of evidence that go beyond journalistic reporting. What is not in dispute, based on available reports, is that the British monarchy has entered genuinely new territory. The rules have changed. The protections that once came automatically with a royal title have been formally conditioned on compliance, transparency, and institutional accountability. The assumption that family connections shield individuals from scrutiny has been explicitly rejected. And at the center of all of it is a man who, according to everything we can observe, has decided that the monarchy he inherits will either stand for something meaningful, or he will not preserve it at the cost of his own integrity. That is not a small thing. That is, in the context of an institution that has spent centuries prioritizing its own survival above almost everything else, actually quite extraordinary. That is the kind of choice that defines leadership, that separates those who simply occupy positions from those who actually use them. Whether the foundations William is laying now will hold, whether the reforms will prove durable, whether the family fractures created in 2026 will eventually heal or harden into permanent divisions, these are the questions that will define the next chapter of the British monarchy's long and endlessly complicated story. And if history is any guide, the next chapter will surprise all of us. It always does. Just when we think we understand how this family operates, just when we convince ourselves that we've seen everything, just when we settle into comfortable assumptions about what royalty can and cannot do, they find a way to remind us that the only constant is change. March 10th, 2026, was one of those reminders.